Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to be here. For me, it's really an honor. Thank you to the organizing committee, to everyone, and to Mother Nature for this beautiful land. And so today, I chose a quite challenging title, The Network Illusion in Functional Brain Mapping. But don't be scared. I'm not going to say that all you've been doing is wrong. I have no disclosures. So in terms of outline, I will start by giving some overview of experimental evidence that we've been finding in resting state activity. And then I will guide you to different mechanistic hypotheses. So first, how this is related to the network structure, or an alternative one where this may be related with waves. And then, how do we choose between two different possible mechanistic hypotheses? Well, usually we need to do some tests to then refine the hypothesis. So I'll show you some ultra-fast experiments I've done to test this wave hypothesis in rats. And then I will show you new mechanistic insight that I'm getting by analyzing signals inside the ventricles as well. And then overall, I will wrap up by proposing some directions of where to go and how should we organize as a community. Well, most of us work with functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, and we've seen that in spontaneous fMRI signals, the signals somehow organize together. So this is a kind of a video. We know fMRI is blurry, it has bad spatial resolution, it's slow, it appears like noisy, but we see some structured patterns in the middle of these cows, right? So these are slices from top to bottom, from a healthy older adult. And we see the signals in different brain areas sometimes correlate together. And this has been observed for over 20 years now. And what we're finding as a community, using different methods, different algorithms, finding that there's an intrinsic repertoire of functional modes that seem to be there all the time. I like Marcus Reichel proposed to call this the brain's dark energy. And it's been like 20 years and we still don't fully understand the origin of this, so I think the term is still valid. But one main thing we can know is that these patterns are consistent in the sense that we can use different methodologies, different data sets from different continents, different populations, and consistently we find some patterns that we call the so-called default modes, or the frontoparietal, or the visual network. And more importantly, these modes or these patterns seem to be meaningful. Right? In the last 20 years, many of us have contributed to show that the default mode network is associated with some psychiatric disorder or syndrome, or the salience network, the cognitive control associated with cognitive performance. But it's important not only to characterize this and to find these differences, but also to understand where this comes from, right? So that we can actually plan and develop strategies for interventions. And one thing I've been working on and analyzing brain activity is to try to characterize these temporal dynamics. How can we extract features that are meaningful? So beyond just showing that this pattern, there's less connectivity overall, how can we characterize this over time? And the idea was to find an algorithm that could identify over time at which time points a given pattern occurs. So I developed an algorithm called LIDA, standing from Leading Eigenvector Dynamics Analysis. So we chose a short name that is easy to say. And basically, it captures, at each time point, it captures how the signal phases are aligned, so a pattern of phase alignment, and then it clusters this into modes of phase alignment, and then assigns each time point to one mode. Okay? I will go a bit in more detail. But one of the things here that is special about this method is that eigenvectors are agnostic to the sign. What does this mean? Is that I can count as an occurrence of the default mode network either if it has a positive or a negative representation of the same pattern. And actually we see this when we look at the signals. That's what drives this correlated fluctuations. We see correlations because it increases and decreases at the same time. So LiDAR captures this, and then we have a measure that is called the occupancy, which is like the proportion of time during a scan in which you spend in a given pattern, okay? So this allows to summarize the whole scan of someone or in large populations. Each scan can be characterized by the occupancy in a given repertoire of modes. Now, the repertoire, these modes are quite consistent, are highly consistent. For example, we analyzed with Fran the Human Connectome project data where people were scanned 4 different times, 100 people. And we ran the algorithm separately in each of the 4 sessions. And for example, when we cluster into 5 modes in each session, the spatial correlation between these, the interclass correlation, was above 97%. And so we find consistently there's a mode where this global mode, so most of the time we are in this global mode where all signals are in phase, they covary together, the signals in the brain, the fMRI signals, so we don't see any segregation or any separation. And then in other time points, we see that the signals in some brain areas, for example in the default mode network, in the nodes, they vary in antiphase with respect to the rest of the brain, right? And here we can recognize some of the modes. And then there's another nice property. We can characterize using this approach the switching dynamics, which is when you are in a given pattern, what's the probability to remain in that pattern in the next time point or to switch to another pattern. So in this type of matrix, what we see is that here in the diagonal, it's the probability, for example, of being in state 1 and remaining in state 1. So this one is quite stable. There's 77%. This is the average across those 100 subjects, but it has quite consistency within subjects. And here in the diagonal, we have higher values, meaning that these modes, there's more probability of remaining in that mode in the next time point than to switch to any of the others. But there's a characteristic also in this matrix. This first line here is lighter, meaning that there's always more probability, whatever state you are, to switch to the global mode, back to the global mode. This is the global mode. And whatever you may switch, for example, to the default mode network, and then there's more probability to return back to the global mode than to switch to any of the others. So in a way, we're kind of capturing something like some form of stability. So we could say that this mode here is kind of the main attractor in this strange attractor dynamics. And these other modes to which we go recurrently, yet briefly, but it consistently appears in all the other subjects, can be understood in an abstract sense, borrowing terms from dynamical systems theory as ghost attractors. And this global mode occurs most of the time, just remind of this. Now, we've used this tool already since 2017 was the first study, so the representation of the networks here is a bit more different, but this would be the global mode. And we found that participants that have better cognitive performance had more occurrence of the global mode compared to the poor performers, and then the poor performers have more of occurrence of the other modes. Well, this was a result, it was significant, but I'll come back to this later. Then we also found, for example, we applied to an open source data set, the COBRE data set on schizophrenia, and we found that patients with schizophrenia, of course it's a very diverse disease, it's an umbrella disease, but they tend to spend significantly less time in this global mode, also less time in the default mode network, and they have increased excursions to other networks that appear to be functionally relevant, like the visual network or the somatomotor network. And then, this is another example. For example, we characterized a data set where people were in remission from recurrent major depressive disorder, and we found a particular pattern that was significantly occurring less. You know, when we see it over time, we see significantly less time. The changes sometimes maybe just 2 to 3%, but it's occurring less in people with depression. Now, what these modes detected with LiDAR, how do they relate? It's interesting to see how they relate with the known canonical resting state networks. Well, we don't know, we don't have the ground truth of what they are, but I used the template from Thomas Yeo to see how the modes that we're detecting, for example, here is when I have k equal 8 modes detected with LiDAR in the ABIDE data set, the Autism Brain Imaging Data Exchange, more than 1,000 scans. And I do to 8 because one of my modes is this global mode of the LiDAR modes, and the other 7 modes that appear, all of them coincide with resting state networks from the literature. So there is indeed a discrete repertoire of patterns that consistently appears across subjects. As we see here, these are different slices from the bottom, so we see how this dark energy accumulates in different parts of the brain. One thing of this method as well is that each voxel is not exclusive to one single mode. So the same brain area can belong to more than one modes here, like these parietal or angular gyrus areas. So we allow this spatial overlap, and we see some spatial overlap between modes. Now, how many modes do we choose? Because actually here I say k equal 8, but some other people may say, there are 10, there are 15, and well, it's not about fighting because we'll never get to a consensus, but we can ask the data, and depending on the question that we want to see, for example, here in the ABIDE data set in autism, we have typically developed controls and individuals from the within the autism spectrum. So what we do, the approach that we've been implementing, is that we cluster into an increasing number of clusters, for example, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then for each mode, we compare the probability of occurrence in controls, in the average, and in autism, and we compute statistics. We compute permutation testing, we can do t-tests, whatever, but we do the p-value. And what's important is to look at the p-value and effect size. And here, this is a plot of the p-values as we increase the number of clusters. And here, the scale here is a logarithmic scale. So everything above this red line means that the p-value is above 0.05, so it doesn't matter. When we are below 0.05, there's this, since we are making many comparisons, there's this family-wise error rate, so we need to correct for the number of comparisons that we're doing. So there are different ways to correct, but the most stringent one, which is the Bonferroni correction, is to correct by all the comparisons we're doing. In this case, it's like more than 200 modes, so this blue line. And we see that some clusters, so these blue points here, mean that they pass this stringent threshold by several orders of magnitude. So this is a p-value of 10 to minus 7. And when we look here in the pyramid, I color the bar plots in blue for the ones that were significantly different. And we find that they always correspond to the same pattern. You cannot see it very well, but in the next slide I will show. So these blue points here that pass significant difference, and we chose here the smallest one. So it was obtained for k equal 15. So now we're going to look at that mode. So this is purely data-driven, right? I didn't ask for the default mode network, and suddenly the mode that differentiates the two conditions seems to be like the occupancy. So in people in the autism spectrum, we detect significantly less occurrence of the default mode network. And this kind of correlates with some scores, especially these stereotype behaviors and restricted interests, and also relating with social impairment and autistic traits. But still, the correlations are not super strong. Well, these modes can also be modulated by drugs. We've done an experiment where we show with psilocybin. So here, the second condition here is after having psilocybin, and this is before and after placebo. And psilocybin, you know, it's the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. But we see a significant decrease in the lateral frontoparietal, and these results were recently replicated in a completely independent data set, also applying LiDAR to data from psilocybin. So overall, as a summary of this experimental observation, is that we have reference values, like this healthy range of occupancy of these networks. This seems to be moderately reliable for the same person in different scans. And we're finding that there are altered values. You see here, there's a potential for biomarking in the sense that maybe there's a difference. We're finding differences in specific networks in different conditions, cognitive function. But maybe what's more important is to understand how we can tune these values? How can we increase the occupancy of a network or decrease? So we're finding these insights with psychoactive compounds. Deep brain stimulation, we also published that it decreases the motor but also increases the limbic occupancy, and also natural stimuli, right? So watching smiling babies, listening to music, or even mindfulness meditation. So we have this repertoire of modes, and without further extension because I need time, that are consistent, defined in space, recurrent over time. But what are their generative mechanisms? So the first thing is to think, okay, functional network, we have a structural network, so that's the most obvious explanation, that these networks reflect something related with the physical network. The fastest way to look at this is to question if these would be harmonic modes of the connectome. So there's something you can compute the graph Laplacian eigenvectors and see if actually the modes of the connectome correspond to the ones you see. Well, there's not an exact one-to-one correspondence. You still see some patterns, but actually maybe the problem is because neural networks are nonlinear. So the graph Laplacian assumes a diffusive process as if things would go through the nodes without having any dynamics. And we need a dynamical model to simulate this. So I've been working on this. I did a review paper also on the different models that exist, where we couple the different brain areas together using some equations. This is an example. You can use different models for the node dynamics. You can make different assumptions. But overall, I will here show the most simple, because phase oscillators seem to be working quite well in general, where you use the Kuramoto model of coupled oscillators, and we show, for example, a specific property that as we increase the global coupling, so if the coupling is 0, things are incoherent and the oscillators are just randomly oscillating. If we further increase the coupling, everything is synchronized. So there's a sweet spot where you have metastable cluster synchrony. And then when we compare this simulation, so we have the model, we simulate, we find this critical range, and we find that this is the structural connectivity, this is the empirical functional connectivity for a given seed, and we find that with the model, we kind of replicate some features of functional connectivity. It's not a one-to-one correspondence, but it allows this to be a valid mechanistic hypothesis. And then what's about the switching dynamics? The switching dynamics considers if we have more than one possible cluster that can synchronize, the system is not fully synchronized, but then one cluster synchronizes, then the other, so we can have multiple weakly stable states, and then you either spontaneously or driven by noise, you can switch between these states. And there has been seminal work by Victor Gis, I see here, others, Michael Breakspear has also done a lot of work on this direction, to explain how even with this type of models we can get a nice switching dynamics between different states. Now, there's this hypothesis, right, that this is actually propagation through the structural network, but this doesn't explain why we find anti-correlations, right? Unless you tweak the model to allow for negative coupling. And another mechanistic hypothesis that has been emerging is whether this could be the expression of resonant waves in the brain continuum, let's say. So these are fundamentally distinct mechanistic scenarios that we need to contrast, right? So in general, how this was tested was to the work by James Peng, led by Alex Fornito. They used the surface geometry of the brain to define what would be the modes of resonance in this type of pattern. And indeed, this drives correlations and anti-correlations. So you can find places it's like a wave pattern. And you can reconstruct brain activity as a linear sum of these harmonic waves. So this can be a valid hypothesis, but it's not sufficient to refute the other, right? So there's one characteristic that I liked. So when I was working with network models, but I was like, maybe there's something interesting here, because actually in waves you always have this fundamental mode, so this could explain why we go back to this baseline state that is so strong, the global in sleep, anesthesia, coma, all these things. And then you have these harmonic modes that drive anti-correlations, that create gradients, right? You have polarization of the system into different signs. So this could have some mechanistic thing. But one property of these harmonic modes is that they oscillate in time. This is an expression of resonance, like waves traveling in different directions eventually create echoes, let's say, in the brain. So I thought, can we check if the modes actually oscillate? And I thought, we need new experiments to check if our resting state networks oscillate in time. Because with the temporal resolution we have in fMRI, we cannot see that. We see that there's power at slow frequencies, but we cannot see that. Well, for that, experiments in rodents and other species are useful. There was a consensus paper showing that you find resting state networks in rats and in rodents. And I found particularly interesting this work by Daniel Gutierrez Barragan, led by Alessandro Gozzi, who will speak this afternoon, where we could see that this activation of the DMN seemed to be followed a positive representation of the network here, followed by a negative representation of the network. Okay, so we did ultra-fast experiments. This was in collaboration. Sorry, because I don't understand why it's not playing, which is very important. Okay, yeah. So I put 6 different rats in the scanner under like this medetomidine condition, and we did single slice acquisitions to reach ultra-fast resolution. Like, I don't care so much now about the spatial organization, but I want to see if these behave like waves. And indeed, we can see, if we wait for some time, consistent patterns of long-range functional connectivity with anti-correlations that seem to reveal some wave dynamics, some continuum dynamics, right? It doesn't, we decompose this activity, so we put this all together. We have 12 scans in this condition, but we have 16,000 frames per scan. So we do the mode decomposition just as principal components. And then for each component, I look at the temporal signal, which is the weight of that principal component at each time point. And what we found is that the weights, the coefficients of each principal component oscillate in time, which is not a direct characteristic of principal component. So we're finding spatial wave patterns whose coefficients oscillate in time. And this here, I show really a very clear peak in the power spectrum. The peak, there's a movement here, is at 0.2, so there was a slide here in the frequency. But in these animals, we find that they have a very clear peak and they oscillate. So this is the spatial pattern multiplied by its temporal coefficients. And we see that there's a clear thing. So what does this mean? That this is nice because it explains long-range correlations, even if there was no connection, even if this was just a tube, and also anti-correlations. And also when different modes activate, they can activate different subsystems and also create gradients, which is also a property. And if we look at the anatomy of the brain, there is no clear structural boundary there at the place of the functional boundaries. So the functional boundaries would be nodes. Now again, we can, following also other works, the recorded fMRI signals that we are detecting, you saw that were a bit noisy, we can decompose it into these common components, these basis patterns that we see across animals, and then we sum them. It's really just a linear sum, right? Because eigenmodes like principal components obey the wave superposition principle, or in the sense they are orthogonal. But it's really nice because we can express this complex activity, and then we see that depending on how these modes, in which phase they are, we can have the illusion of seeing like traveling waves going in one direction, then they seem to be going down, then they seem to be going up. But the basis, we know it's just static patterns, right, that oscillate in time. Okay, and so then we gave anesthesia, and we show that anesthesia seems to be dampening these oscillations, So I'm kind of, this is a very mechanistic, abstract, phenomenological interpretation that maybe what some anesthetics may be operating at is at a level that is not at the level, of course, they will interact with the channels and neurotransmitters, but maybe also damping these oscillations that we are observing in these modes. And medetomidine is known to increase this oscillatory behavior of resting state networks. So we made a model. We just took like these basis functions, these wave patterns, and we made them oscillate with just a random oscillatory model, and then we summed them all. There was a problem with the equations, but the idea is to show that if you sum these waves that are just randomly vibrating in a way, you can get patterns of long-range functional connectivity in the simulated dynamics. Okay, so we have these two different models, and I have 15 minutes now. And so, both of them, they kind of replicate a significant portion of functional connectivity. You can tweak the models, increase, change parameters to have a better and better and better fitting. But here the thing is at the mechanistic level that I'm interested. So the multi-stability in network models comes either from cluster synchronization or change between topological scales. So is it the global synchrony or clusters, intermediate synchrony or asynchrony? In geometric models, this multi-stability is given by different eigenmodes, like modes of resonance, so each of them is a possible. I put here harmonics in the network models because, as I saw, there are some people computing the harmonics directly on the structural network. But now, there is something that is missing, and that's what I want to make the point now for the rest. The overlap with the resting state networks that we see in the data is not a one-to-one correspondence. And some people say, maybe the DMN is a combination of different basis functions, but then it wouldn't explain why it appears recurrently in all the subjects all the time and we see it so easily. So maybe there's a limitation in tractography. Also, in the geometric models, maybe there are limitations in 3D models. It's not just the surface. Of course, there's a 3D properties that need to be taken into account. But is this really that, or are we maybe with the wrong model? And also the range of ultra-slow frequencies in some network models, you actually input into the network directly in the model a slow oscillation, assuming there's an intrinsic rhythmogenesis at that slow frequency, or in terms of wave patterns, it's more like the frequency at which those waves vibrate. But then could there be something else? Could there be an elephant in the room that we keep hiding and then no one is looking at, and that may be also playing a player? I'm not saying that the others are wrong, but there may be an additional player. So when we look at the brain activity, this is the global mode. If I just do a minimal preprocessing and I don't care about which part of the brain I am, and I don't hide and I don't put a mask in the ventricles, and or remove CSF components. And what we're finding is that, I think you're seeing here the elephant, but this has been reported, I'm not the first to show this, of course, that the signals inside the ventricles are in antiphase with the global signal, right? So whenever the entire brain, there's an increase in, let's say, neural activity driving both oxygenation, this is one of the possible mechanisms, that then increasing blood flushes the CSF out of the ventricles and vice versa. So this has been termed the bold CSF coupling, and there was a science paper in 2019 showing that, for example, the signal in the fourth ventricle captured fluid inflow into the ventricle. And after that seminal paper, there have been a series of works showing how this so-called bold CSF coupling, here they say cerebrospinal fluid flow and global brain activity, is linked, for example, with Alzheimer's disease pathology. So you have a mask for the entire brain, you have a mask for the fourth ventricle, and they show that healthy controls have more negative coupling, and as you progress in the Alzheimer's disease stage, you decrease this. This global signal seems to be related with these ventricles, but it's also related with the entire physiology of the body. There's a recent paper came out in Nature Neuroscience, where some of you are co-authors, where we clearly see this global signal. In the figures, if you zoom in, the signals in the ventricles, even in the lateral ventricles as well, seem to be in antiphase with the global signal. But this signal correlates with pupil diameter, with heart rate, with EEG waveforms, with the respiration volume. So it seems to be a very macro-scale phenomena, right? So then, going back to that first LIDA paper that I did showing that cognitive performance was related with more global signal, I thought, okay, so if the first mode is in antiphase with the ventricles, what happens with the other modes? How do they relate with the signals in the ventricles? So I took the ADNI's Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative data set, where they had in the one version where they have 599 raw fMRI scans with different conditions, and I did minimal preprocessing without removing CSF components and applied LiDAR to the entire brain. So now I'll show you the results of what I obtained when clustering into 4 clusters. So the first cluster, the mode number 1, which was the global, indeed we find a phase shift or anti-correlation between the signals inside the ventricles with the global brain. I'm using here the colors that they use for gold CSF couplet, just to vary a bit from the typical red and blue. But what we're finding in terms of occupancy, remember, controls have significantly more occurrence of this mode compared to early MCI, late MCI, and Alzheimer's disease. But now what is mode 2? Okay, another mode that was found to decrease occurrence in Alzheimer's disease, and in this case, it's really in the last stage of Alzheimer's disease that we see a significant difference. Here there seems to be an increase, but this is not significant. So this here, I do the 3D rendering. And then there are 2 other modes that were found to increase occurrence with cognitive decline. You look at this and you'll say, maybe that's artifact. Yeah, okay, but until we know if it's really artifact, I prefer to keep it in the signal because it's giving fairly significant results. This last mode here that we're seeing, I will go a bit into detail, already between controls and early mild cognitive impairment, it shows a highly significant, so blue means that it survives Bonferroni correction, increase in occupancy. So what are these modes? I tried here I was trying yesterday to do this. Actually, what does it mean? Like, so trying to render, so when you increase the signal in the brain, it decreases inside the ventricles, then it decreases in the brain, the blue, and increases in the others. And now we find these other modes. And let me now call the attention. For example, we see, here you see, when we look here, it looks like there's a continuity between the ventricle signals and the frontal gyrus. And then here at the back, the posterior cingulate correlated with the angular gyrus. So if we then just take only the cortical voxels and color them accordingly, see that it clearly reveals the so-called default mode network, right, that we've been looking for. And it seems that the nodes in the default mode network that are usually sulci and gyruses correlate with the signal inside the ventricles. And then the other one, so this seems to be a good thing to have because it decreases with disease. And then the ones that increase, here I'm showing, it seems like the signal, instead of going there to the frontal top, it's going like downwards or upwards or backwards. So indeed, this, you may say, it's motion artifact. Maybe it's motion, I don't know what it is. But the signals inside fMRI are showing this. And I think it's important to show this and not to ignore this elephant in the room and keep saying, yeah, it's artifacts. This is still under revision. But I think conferences are good places to show and publish data because we can debate and discuss. So what we're finding in terms of how this, I call them brave modes, like brain ventricle, okay? So there are some brave modes. If the arrow goes in this direction, means they are protective. They go more to the cognitive, so the global versus ventricle versus CSF. But then the DMN, and also a 5th mode that we're finding that correlates significantly, so it's found with increased K, that reveals the frontoparietal network, are good. And then there are bad modes, which are the ones that look more like artifacts. Also, we correlated with composite scores of cognitive scores. So for memory, we found this is the only one passing Bonferroni correction. There's this pattern that clearly reveals the frontoparietal network that correlates significantly with the memory score. Then the executive function, negatively. The more you have this one, where the signal seems to be going downwards and upwards, you can overlap it and it reveals the limbic system, but I mean the spatial overlap is not clearly there, maybe salience network. This one also correlated negatively with executive function. And then there was like some modes when you highly increase the K, when we have like 15 clusters, we have these asymmetric modes, because usually the modes are symmetric, but it's not, they are forced by the method. Sometimes you can have an asymmetric mode. And this occurrence of this asymmetric mode occurs more in people who have visual spatial dysfunction, like they cannot really, so there's something in this symmetry that seems to be related with cognition. Okay. So, my message here is that we still lack a complete understanding of brain function, okay, there's millions of people waiting for us to get this right. It's for our own good as well that we get this right on time. But what I want here to call the attention is that explore that, look at it differently, try to think a bit out of the box. I mean, maybe you'll think, she's nuts, but I'm sharing what I'm finding, and if we all and trying not to immediately mask out certain properties and really show them and try to understand. I still don't have a clear picture. What I think is that we can look at the brain from different perspectives. We are many in this field, and I think we don't need to all go in the same direction. We can work as a community and share when you have good results, do good statistics, prove evidence-based science, right? It's not here about saying how important you are or how much money you have or how much, it's really about following the right direction and doing, and allowing to challenge dogmas, because science is not dogmatic, so that's why I like science. You're allowed to say these things a bit nuts. Maybe we need to improve the models. So I recently got this one just to impress. It's with a collaboration with the biomechanics department, where we did a finite element model using the multi-compartment MNI parcellation, and seeing how you can really, what would be the modes of resonance of this three-dimensional structure. The modes still don't align perfectly, but it could be a direction to go. And sometimes, we don't need to be afraid, if it's the right way to go, sometimes we can just change directions. I've seen a bus turned around before, so it's not impossible, right? So I challenge you to just, I don't know, next time you analyze data, take a look at the signals also in the ventricles and check what's going on there, or instead of just focusing on parcellations and matrices, because I came from there. I was working first in the beginning only with matrices, and I'm like, there's more than matrices, right? There's a physical system here. And, well, yeah, thank you for your attention. I'm recently moving to the University of Lisbon, but this is my group at the University of Minho, mostly with psychiatrists. Also the group where I did preclinical MRI at the Champalimaud Center for the Unknown. I invite you to come to Vanya's poster tomorrow, where we're showing this autism data set and analysis. A special thank to my collaborators, with who, even if we just don't, there are more than this, there are many of you here with who I've discussed crazy ideas, and even if we don't publish together, just the fact that we allow ourselves, I love this community, because we're sometimes in a nice chat, we can go into insightful discussions about the brain, so thank you all. Also to my kids who've been so patient, and fighting, understanding why mommy needs to be here and why mommy sends so many messages in the computer. And I invite you, I like to call, I will be in Toronto at the Brain Modes Conference that John Griffiths is organizing this year. And also I'm co-organizing this NUSA workshop here in Australia next year. So you're invited to come. The registrations will open soon. And thank you.
Thank you for that fascinating and stimulating talk. I have to tell you that the #1 comments in the chat are that we love you and your energy. So to move on to something stimulating, the top-rated question is, as if fMRI is also driven by vascular effects, could those explain the discrepancies between the structural and functional connectivity?
That's a very important, a very nice question. And it's true that, yeah, vascular effects also change a lot. There have been people showing that there are vibrations even in the arterioles. But it's not just the arterioles, the entire tissue seems to be vibrating. So the question is it just vascular? Is it even broader? So looking at the blood dynamics has been something that has been gone from many years. The CSF is a kind of new player that came into account, but maybe pressure waves could also interact with blood, with CSF, with neural tissue, and create features that maybe we're capturing. So, yeah, it could. Yeah. So my final answer is yes, it could be.
Okay, and to follow up on that, someone asks, given the sluggish bold response, could we use EEG or MEG instead to better characterize those oscillating waves?
That's a very good question, and that was like for me, that's the holy grail, understanding the relationship between EEG and fMRI. And I know, Shella, you've done some nice work trying to relate electric field potentials with fMRI signals. So first, when I did these ultra-fast experiments in fMRI, I wanted to see if we could capture, going to an Equus frequency of 12 hertz, if we could see EEG waves. But we don't. There are some waves that we see. These ones, the ultra-slow waves, that the signals in the ventricles are locked in phase with the signals in the EEG signals. In the science paper from Nina Fultz, she showed this. So maybe there's a different mechanism. So EEG would not capture so well, I guess, pressure waves because it's more focused on the electromagnetic field, although there can be pressure electroacoustic phenomena, let's say. But so my side on this is that, yes, EEG, but maybe ultra-slow EEG. We should revisit and understand better what's going on in ultra-slow EEG, because usually it's discarded. There are even commercial EEGs that immediately have a filter below 0.5 hertz, so we're not even seeing those waves, but we know they're there. They're everywhere.
Yeah, infraslow is cool. Just throwing in an opinion there. To go back to the questions, is there a basis consistency as the number of modes K is increased? That is, do modes from lower K split into modes of higher K? Like, is there a hierarchy?
Yes, you can analyze it from that perspective, indeed, because when we compute the overlap, it seems that as you increase the K, the default mode network starts splitting into more and more different sub-configurations. And for example, the one that we found different in autism did not include the temporal pole. And you know that the MN sometimes has the temporal pole. So it splits into these two, and the one that is changed in autism is just the frontal with angular gyrus. Yeah, so indeed, yes, but maybe it's a way to analyze, our way of analyzing the data that reveals that, but I think so. I never did a proper hierarchical analysis.
Very cool. And here's a really interesting one about the brain-ventricle coupling. Do you account for brain atrophy when evaluating the relationship between brave modes and cognitive decline?
That is also an excellent question. Unfortunately, I'm not superhuman, so I don't have time. I didn't have time to really look at those correlates. But from the database in the ADNI, well, I just analyzed the signals. So now my take on that is, even if there's brain atrophy, okay, so if we have a disrupted flow into some brain areas, or the lymphatics is not working properly, maybe that could be the cause of brain atrophy, or it could relate with that. So the fact that we see this less occurrence of these modes already in children, maybe in the long term that can lead to brain atrophy. So maybe there's a correlation. And we know now that brain atrophy, for example, even in anorexia, can be reverted after people recover their body mass index. So it could be, there's more in brain atrophy than just neural death, and maybe it could be like lack of water. You know, when things are more dry, they can have less cortical thickness. I don't know. It's just speculation.
And maybe one last one on a similar topic. If I'm not mistaken, the ventricles are all connected. How can you have only some ventricles in your components, and can this be linked to pressure emanating from the blood vessels on the CSF somehow?
Yes, it's possible. Everything is connected, you know, it's very hard to differentiate. One way that maybe we could separate things is to use phantom structures, where you have a silicon model where you have the ventricles, and see if indeed we can generate this type of activity. So I'm not seeing signal in some parts of the fluid circuitry, maybe just because it's not in phase or aligning in phase. So, I mean, it deserves further exploration, yes, and that direction is one way to go.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I think we're out of time for this session. Please fill out your evaluations, and let's thank our speaker one more time.